King Charles has named his youngest brother, Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh, a title held, of course, by his late father, Prince Philip, for more than 70 years. It had been the late Prince's wish for Prince Edward to be granted the dukedom after his death.
It's been a bit of a shock.
Everyone has a right to think what they want.
Camilla's son thought he could get away with using the king's private home for his own business, but Prince Edward caught him in the act, and what happened next shook the entire palace. The morning started normally at Sandringham House. The king was not scheduled to be there that week. No official event had been placed on the royal calendar. The staff had been told a private family gathering was planned, and they had been asked to prepare the house accordingly. Tables were being set in the dining room. Food was coming in through the back entrance. New faces were moving through the halls that the regular staff didn't recognize and hadn't been introduced to. Nobody had asked questions out loud because the instruction had come from someone above them, and in a household like this, you follow instructions from above, and you raise concerns only when you are very sure that raising them will not cost you more than staying quiet. But the staff were moving with a particular kind of tension that day, the kind that comes from doing a job you are not fully comfortable with, for reasons you haven't been given clearly enough to explain to yourself. And the delivery trucks parked along the service road at the back of the estate had no royal warrant seal on the side. The people stepping out of those trucks were carrying wine crates and supply boxes. They were moving fast, like people on a tight schedule who had somewhere else to be when this was finished. By the time Prince Edward's car turned through the front gates just before noon, the estate already looked nothing like it was supposed to look on a quiet week with no royal visitors. And here is what nobody was expecting that morning. Edward wasn't supposed to be there either. He had arranged a routine visit to check on repair work that had been scheduled on the east wing roof. It was the kind of task he handles personally, because that is how he works. He doesn't send someone else. He shows up, he checks, he signs off, and he leaves. It should have taken no more than an hour, but as his car slowed near the main entrance, he saw something that made him sit forward in his seat. There were too many cars parked near the front steps. Not the kind of cars that belong to house staff or maintenance workers. These were low, expensive cars with personalized number plates. There were men in sharp suits standing near the entrance with phones pressed to their ears. There were young people in white chef uniforms moving quickly between the side entrance and the main hall. Edward stepped out of the car, put his hands behind his back, and walked toward the front door at a steady pace. The head of house staff appeared at the entrance before Edward reached the steps. He tried to slow things down with polite words. He mentioned a family arrangement and suggested Edward might want to wait while he made a quick call to clarify the situation. Edward looked at him once, and without saying a word, the man stepped aside. Inside the entrance hall, Edward could already smell the food. He could hear voices coming from the direction of the king's private drawing room, and among those voices was laughter. Not the quiet, reserved kind of laughter that belongs in these rooms, but loud, easy laughter from people who felt completely safe and completely comfortable. He walked down the corridor and stopped in the doorway. The king's private drawing room had been set up like a restaurant. Wine glasses were sitting directly on the antique side tables, without coasters, on surfaces that were over 200 years old. Strangers were sitting in the king's personal chairs. There were printed menus on the tables and half-eaten food on plates that had been placed on furniture that had never been designed for it. And standing right in the center of the room, holding a glass of red wine and talking to a group of well-dressed businessmen, was Tom Parker Bowles, Queen Camilla's son. He was pointing at the paintings on the wall, the king's own personal paintings, and talking about them the way a man talks about things that belong to him. Edward stood in the doorway and did not move for a full minute. He counted the guests. He looked at the state of the room. Then Tom looked up and saw him. The smile left Tom's face immediately. He got it back quickly and walked across the room with his hand out and his voice set to its friendliest tone. "Uncle Edward, what a surprise to see you here." Edward did not take the hand. He looked around the room slowly, then looked back at Tom. "Explain to me why there are strangers sitting in His Majesty's house," he said, in a voice so quiet and level that the guests closest to them stopped talking to hear it. Tom tried to manage the situation. He stated that his mother had given her approval, and it was just a small lunch for a few people he knew. But while he was talking, Edward had already looked past him at the table nearby, where a printed document was sitting under the base of a wine bottle. He picked it up and read it. It was a price list, £5,000 per person. 12 guests in the room. That was £60,000 collected in a single afternoon in the king's private home, marketed under the name of Tom's food consultancy business. No palace authorization, no legal paperwork, no permission from the king, and no record of the event in any royal household office. But keep watching, because what Edward found when he walked through the rest of the house made everything way worse than it should be. He told the guests, calmly and clearly, that the event was over. The house staff moved with immediate and visible relief, the one that comes when someone with authority finally arrives and gives you permission to do what you already knew was right. The guests filed out through the entrance hall, collecting their coats and murmuring to each other, confused, but sensing they had walked into something they didn't fully understand. They had each paid £5,000 for what they believed was a rare, exclusive experience inside a royal home. None of them had known that the man selling that experience had no right to sell it. None of them had known that the king himself had never been asked and would never have agreed. Tom started to speak again, but Edward walked past him into the corridor. In the kitchen, extra gas burners had been brought in from outside and placed on surfaces not designed for that kind of heat. There were scorch marks on the main countertop, dark and clear. The larder had been partly emptied and restocked with ingredients from outside suppliers, none of them on the approved vendor list for the estate. Near the back door, stacked in a neat pile, were printed menus on thick cardstock with a gold-embossed heading that read, "A Curated Royal Estate Experience" by Tom Parker Bowles. Edward picked one up and looked at it for a moment. Then he set it back on the pile and continued through the house. He went through the papers on the kitchen table. He moved through them slowly, one by one. Supplier receipts, guest booking confirmations, a printed schedule for the day that laid out timings, room usage, and service flow in precise detail. Someone had planned this carefully. This was not something put together in a rush at the last minute. This had been organized over a period of time by someone who knew the house well enough to know which rooms worked and which staff could be counted on. And then, toward the bottom of the pile, Edward found a handwritten note on small notepaper. He recognized the handwriting immediately. He had seen it many times across many years, on birthday cards, on letters, on notes passed at family gatherings. It was Camilla's handwriting. The note was short. It told Tom which rooms he could use, which members of the house staff could be trusted to handle the day without raising any issues upward. And it ended with the words, "Just don't let it become a habit, darling." Edward folded the note, put it in his jacket pocket, and stepped outside. He took out his phone and called Queen Camilla. The call rang 4 times. When she answered, her voice was warm and relaxed. She didn't know yet where he was calling from. She asked how his day was going. She mentioned something about the weather in London, with a light and easy voice. However, in a normal way, Edward would have replied with a smile in his voice, following the polite rules that had governed his life for 60 years. He respected the crown, and he respected the woman his brother had chosen to sit beside him on the throne. But as he stood in the cold air of the Sandringham Gardens, holding evidence of a massive betrayal in his pocket, the normal way of responding felt very far away. He waited for a tiny break in her sentence, just enough to be polite, but not a second longer. "Your Majesty," he said, using her formal title to signal that this was no longer a casual family chat. "Please forgive the interruption, but I am currently standing at Sandringham. I find myself in a very difficult position, and I need you to tell me exactly what you knew about what Tom was doing here today." There was a silence on the other end of the line. It wasn't the silence of a dropped call. It was a heavy, loaded silence. By calling her Your Majesty, Edward wasn't being mean. He was reminding her of her responsibility to the king. He was showing her respect, but he was also telling her that he was speaking to her as a prince of the blood who had just found a major problem in the king's own house. Then she finally spoke, stating that she had given Tom permission for a small gathering. She described it as low-key and informal, and she hadn't imagined it would amount to anything significant. She said she was sure it had all been handled properly. Her voice stayed smooth and controlled, but something underneath it had changed. It sounded like someone who is still trying to figure out exactly how much the other person already knows. Edward read her one line from the price list, £5,000 per person, and this time the silence was longer. Camilla began to explain that she hadn't understood it would become a commercial event. She said Tom must have taken her permission further than she had intended. She was certain they could find a way to work it out properly and quietly, not to the point of using the king's private room. She started to suggest that there might have been a miscommunication between Tom's team and the house staff, and that perhaps a conversation with the household manager could clear things up. She was still trying to manage the situation from a distance, and still trying to find a version of events that left room for the whole thing to be resolved without going any higher. But then Edward told her about the note, with her handwriting, naming specific members of the house staff who could be trusted to handle the day without raising any concerns upward. She went silent, not the silence, but when she spoke again, her voice had changed. The warmth was still there, but the ease behind it had gone. She said, "Edward, I think we need to handle this with a great deal of care." That was the moment Edward had everything he needed to know. This was not a misunderstanding. Tom had not simply gone too far with a casual permission given without much thought. Camilla had known what was being planned. She had helped structure it. She had told her son which rooms he could use, which staff would not cause problems, and she had done all of that while the king was away from the property and had no idea any of it was happening. The whole event had been deliberate, organized, and careful, and the king had been kept entirely in the dark from beginning to end. "I'm going to go see His Majesty," Edward said. He ended the call and stood outside in the cold for a moment, looking at the frost that was still sitting on the grass in the shade of the wall where the winter sun hadn't reached yet. Then he walked back to his car. King Charles was at Highgrove that afternoon. When Edward arrived and explained he needed to speak with the king privately, a member of staff told him Charles was in the walled garden. Edward had been to Highgrove enough times to know his way through the grounds. He walked through the low wooden gate at the entrance to the garden and followed the stone path until he found his brother standing beside a raised herb bed near the far wall, looking at the rosemary plant. There was something very ordinary and very peaceful about the image. The king in old clothes, hands in soil, completely absorbed in something simple. It was the version of Charles that the public rarely sees, and the version that Edward has always found the most recognizable. The king turned around when he heard footsteps on the path, and his face opened into a warm and unguarded smile. It was the kind of smile that appears when someone you genuinely trust comes toward you unexpectedly. Two protection officers stood near the garden entrance, watching the exchange. Edward stopped a few paces back, acknowledging the presence of the guards and the crown first. "Your Majesty," Edward said, his voice steady and formal for the sake of the men watching. The king nodded to the guards, a small signal that he wished to be left alone with his brother. As the officers stepped back out of earshot, the smile on the king's face changed the moment he registered the true expression on Edward's face. It didn't disappear. It softened into something more careful and more watchful. He brushed the soil from his hands. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just waited. Edward went through it all in order. He was careful and deliberate. He described the cars in the driveway, and the strangers settled into the drawing room. He explained the price list and what the numbers on it meant. He described the branded menus and the outside suppliers and the state of the kitchen. He described finding the note, and then he reached into his jacket pocket, took out the folded piece of notepaper, and held it out. The king took the note with both hands. He read it. He read it a second time. Then he sat very still, with the note held in front of him, and looked at his wife's handwriting and said nothing at all. The garden was quiet in a way that felt heavier than normal quiet. There was no wind, no sound from outside the walls, just the two brothers on that bench and the note between them. The king said very quietly, as if he was saying something to himself that he needed to hear, "She knew." Edward nodded in response. He asked how much. Edward told him £60,000. In one afternoon, the king stood up slowly and walked to the far end of the path and stood there with his back to Edward, looking at the garden in front of him, for what felt like a long time. He did not make a sound. When he finally turned around, his face was composed in the way that people who have spent their whole lives in public learn to compose themselves. His voice when he spoke was steady and clear. "I want the lawyers called tonight," he said. Here is where the situation changed from a family matter into something with much wider consequences. The palace lawyers arrived at Clarence House the following morning, 3 of them sitting around the table with files open in front of them and expressions that were professionally neutral in the way that expensive lawyers always manage to be, even when the subject matter is anything but neutral. The question they had been called in to address was legally straightforward, even if it was personally complicated. Using a crown property for commercial purposes without authorization from the relevant royal household offices was a serious matter. It did not become less serious because the person involved was connected by marriage to the king. If anything, that connection made the legal exposure more significant, because paying guests had been invited under conditions that implied royal approval, which meant they had been misled about what they were actually paying for. The lawyers used the phrase unauthorized use. They used the word misrepresentation. One of them said the word fraud once, quietly, and it sat in the room after he said it in a way that nobody moved past quickly. They also spent considerable time on Camilla's involvement, because that was the element that made the legal picture more complicated. She had not been physically present at Sandringham on the day, but the handwritten note placed her clearly in the category of material assistance. She had given Tom the operational information he needed to carry out the event. She had identified which rooms to use and which staff members would handle the day without raising concerns. That was not passive. That was planning. One of the lawyers placed the note on the table in a clear plastic sleeve and said that if the matter ever went outside the family, that note would be the central exhibit. Everyone in the room understood what that meant. The recommendation from the legal team was to resolve everything internally. A public case would cause damage to the crown that would outlast any legal outcome. The king agreed, but agreeing to keep it internal did not mean agreeing to let it pass without consequence. 3 days after the legal meeting, there was a family dinner at Windsor Castle. Nobody arrived late. Everyone understood what the evening was, and nobody wanted to draw attention to themselves by being the last one through the door. Camilla was there. Tom was there, sitting in his place without much to say, his contributions to the conversation brief and carefully measured. This was the composure that has been built over decades and tested many times and never fully breaks. But the atmosphere in that room was not the atmosphere of a normal family dinner. Conversations that started lost their momentum before they arrived anywhere. The dinner was awkward and uncomfortable, and there were glances across the table that contained full thoughts that no one was prepared to say out loud. Tom kept his attention on his plate for most of the evening. Camilla maintained her surface composure throughout, but anyone who knew her well could see that it was costing her more than it usually did. Edward said very little and watched everything, but what happened at the very end of the dinner was something that stayed with everyone in that room forever, even after they left Windsor that night. After the table was cleared and the staff had gone, the king gave his decision. Tom Parker Bowles was to be formally and immediately banned from all crown and private royal estate properties for a minimum period of 5 years. Any request for future access would require direct written approval from the king's private office and would be subject to review at his sole discretion. The full £60,000 was to be donated to one of the king's charitable foundations, and Tom was required to write personal letters of apology to every member of the household staff at Sandringham who had been placed in an unfair and untenable position on the day of the event. On the question of Camilla, the king said nothing publicly and made no formal announcement to the press, but he quietly removed her informal authority over the use and scheduling of the private estates. All such decisions would pass directly through the king's office going forward. She would have no independent role in those decisions. Inside the palace, this was understood clearly by everyone who needed to understand it. It was a significant and deliberate removal of informal power, done without a press release or a public statement, and it was permanent. Tom sat still through all of it. He didn't argue. He didn't try to explain or negotiate. When the king finished, Tom nodded once and looked down at the table. There was simply nothing left to say, and he seemed to know that better than anyone. The letters of apology to the Sandringham staff were sent within the week. The donation to the charitable foundation was confirmed shortly after. Camilla continued her public duties without interruption. She appeared at engagements alongside the king, and from the outside, nothing looked different. The removal of her informal authority over the private estates was never announced and never reported at the time. It was the kind of consequence that exists entirely inside the structure of the institution, invisible to anyone who doesn't live within it, but felt immediately and clearly by those who do. The king returned to Highgrove at the weekend. He went back to the walled garden. He knelt beside the same herb bed and pressed soil around the same rosemary plant. He said nothing publicly about any of it, and he never would. He does not speak publicly about private family matters. He never has. However, before that day's Windsor dinner had ended, just as everyone was pushing back their chairs and preparing to leave, the king had looked across the table directly at Tom and said one final thing. His voice was completely calm, and his face was still. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "The estates are not assets to be borrowed," he said. "They are a responsibility to be carried. I hope you now understand the difference." Tom had said nothing. Nobody said anything. There was nothing that could be added to it, and everyone in the room understood that clearly. In the end, those 2 sentences did more lasting work than any legal document or formal punishment, because they didn't just describe what had happened. They named what it had cost. Some things are not primarily about money or legal frameworks or what gets written into an official record. Some things are about what you owe to the people who trust you, and whether you understand the weight of that trust before someone has to show you, or only after it is already too late to wish you had understood it sooner. So, what do you think? Do you think the king was right to punish his family in secret? And does this show that the trust within the palace has been broken for good? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear them. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the following video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.